The Sega Genesis has always been 1/3 of my holy trinity of gaming. If I ever had to just stick to these 3 systems for the rest of my life for some reason, I'd probably be okay with that. And yet, somehow, despite the Genesis having one of my favorite libraries of all time, I'm still occasionally coming across titles that I never knew about. For instance, did you even know about Crystal's Ponytail before just now? It's not good. However, some of these lost games have become new favorites of mine, and I'd even go so far as to call a few of them hidden gems. Now, I don't take that distinction lightly. I don't think a Sega Genesis game is necessarily a hidden gem just because it's good and not Sonic. So you won't be seeing any Dynamite Heady or Chalkin' the Forever Man or Rocket Knight adventures here. To me, these games are not hidden gems. In fact, very few Sega Genesis games are at this point, but to my own surprise, I actually have somehow come up with a handful of Genesis games that haven't really been talked about much, or just haven't been covered in the way that I think they should be. Mark Alisia Dragoon down as a game I wrongfully shrugged off for way too long. It wasn't until sometime within the last couple of years that I actually decided to give this one a real chance. I think I just assumed that Alicia's massive lightning beams, or thunder, just seemed entirely too OP and like it would make the game too easy and boring. But boy am I glad I eventually gave it a shot anyway, because that initial impression I had couldn't have been more wrong. Yes, her attacks can be quite powerful, and require basically no aiming most of the time, but you're also dealing with multiple enemies simultaneously that can take lots of damage, and plenty of fast-moving projectiles coming at you from all around. Plus, the thunder attack loses most of its power if you just fire it off willy-nilly, so letting it rest and charge up is the key to staying on top of things. Kind of like Legendary Axe or Valis 3, but different. Sort of. Not really. Bosses are also absolute tanks and will not let you cheese your way through them without learning their weaknesses. Even the levels themselves want to kill Alisia, so being prepared for deadly gases, random fire sprouting from the ground, and other environmental hazards is also part of the deal. Oh, and you only have 1 life, other than an extremely rare item that gives you a 1-up. So, if you don't have one of those, death means death, and starting the game all the way over. It also means having to sit through what is almost certainly the most long-winded and self-satisfied game over screen of all time.
Cool.
So there's actually quite a bit of depth and challenge here that, if ignored, you won't get very far. Alisia Dragoon ain't messing around. However, these 8 stages are full of secret little paths and hidden areas that usually reward your exploration with more health and power-ups. Thankfully, Alicia's health can take quite a few hits before she's in any real danger, as can each of her 4 animal companions, though that doesn't mean you won't experience a few deaths here and there. Her companions, in particular, will pass away from time to time, as you can't always protect them from taking hits. These little guys can make a huge difference in the game, as each one passively adds to Alicia's firepower in wildly different ways, making them better fits for different situations. For instance, I like to use this guy that occasionally blows up everything on screen for this cave level, and this dude who seems to mostly do damage by just flying into enemies is a good pick for boss fights, since he can deal out damage while you play more defensively and focus on dodging attacks. Like Alisia herself, her animal friends all level up on their own the more you use them, making them more powerful and more helpful. Though that does kind of make it all the more sad when they do inevitably die. I always get a little pit in my stomach when that happens. What's worse is that when they're gone, they're gone. There is an item that can revive 1 at a time, but that's pretty rare. If you don't feel like an animal is needed, just put them away until you do. You can switch between them at any time, so if one is just getting hit a lot and not really helping, maybe switch him out. So while I was extremely wrong to assume this game is easy, it is not. It does give you plenty to work with, between the tight controls, companions that can be extremely helpful if unleashed at the right times, and the steady drip of helpful items. Alisia Dragoon is very doable if you can lock in and play it the way it needs to be played. As you can see, the game's graphics are pretty darn good, all things considered. As a 1992 release, it doesn't have much in terms of visual effects that other Genesis games hadn't already done, with the usual one or two scrolling background layers and some nice animations here and there. But the understated color palettes across all the levels and characters, along with a slightly desaturated overall look, gives the visuals a bit of a more sophisticated and kind of elegant style, which I think sometimes I do prefer over the more over-the-top vibrancy that you'll find in some other Genesis games. Not to keep throwing shade at Dynamite Heady, but I mean, just look at this. This has no artistic restraint whatsoever, which does make perfect sense for that game, I guess, but I don't know. I think this more refined look is just as cool, just maybe in a different way. Kinda apples to oranges, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. The music is extremely well produced. There's a good range of tunes here, and pretty much all of them match the vibe of their levels like a glove by really taking advantage of the Sega Genesis sound chip and using it to its potential. And while a lot of the music does stop just short of being particularly memorable to me, there's a few tracks that shine through nicely and really stand out, like this one here. The sound effects are less remarkable, but still pretty good across the board. They do their job and pretty much just stay out of the music's way, which is probably the right approach. Overall, this is an extremely recommendable game. It distinguishes itself from the dozens of other side-scrolling action games on the Genesis with its high production values, unique combat, and surprising amount of depth. It might not quite crack into my top 5 or even my top 10 games on the system, but it isn't too far behind that. And now that I've really given myself enough time to appreciate everything it's doing, it has emerged as a very special game in my library that I expect to come back to every now and then, and hopefully continue getting better at. If Alisia Dragoon is a glass of fine wine that takes a while to fully appreciate, then Burning Force is a shot of fireball whiskey that immediately punches you in the face with everything that it is. And while there's not a whole lot of meat on the bone here, it is some damn fine meat with some cheese. This is a very straight-up shoot-'em-up from Namco that plays exactly how it looks. It's fast, frenetic, and heavily reliant on your reflexes and general ability to memorize things very quickly. Neither of which are my strong suit, but I still find myself enjoying Burning Force whenever I do play it. Levels all play similarly, with hazards whizzing by and enemies flying around while you're caught in the middle of it all just trying to survive. And while some attempts at variety are thrown in, with different weapon upgrades, a couple special moves, and marginally different enemy behaviors, it's all pretty much the same thing from beginning to end. Arcadey, shooty action, and you'll know if you're a fan of it within about 10 seconds of playing it. You kill stuff, try not to die, and try to hunt down power-ups as much as possible. Now for me, it hits a very certain sweet spot between simplicity and addictiveness, and while I'm not in the mood for something quite this simple as often as I used to be, when I am, very few games answer the call better than this one. My only real issue with Space Harrier-style games like this is that the perspective can often result in enemies and hazards being blocked from view, which has always caused more accidental deaths than I'm comfortable with, and as a result, I never really warmed up to these games as much as other people have. So I really like that Burning Force gives you a similar experience, but with a more functional angle. Which isn't to say Burning Force is totally immune to moments of wonky depth perception. There are definitely some spots where it gets a little janky, but overall, I'd say it generally manages to give you that Space Harrier sense of dimension with less of the side effects. Though the boss battles do play more like a one-to-one Space Harrier clone, though I don't mind it as much when it's an occasional novelty like it is here. The majority of the game is like this, and in my opinion is better for it. While the graphics are pretty simple, I think they work well for what the game is, with vibrant scrolling stripes on the ground and plenty of color among the enemies and, well, pretty much everything else. It's an extremely colorful game, though not particularly detailed. It actually kind of reminds me of Stun Runner on the Atari Lynx in some ways, which isn't a dig necessarily, just an observation. This may very well be on purpose though, since it does run very well. Even when there's a bunch of crap all over the screen, which there often is, it generally feels responsive and well optimized. which is a very good thing for a game like this. The soundtrack is also above average, with a lot of energetic synth parts and sharp drums blasting through your speakers, as with a lot of the better soundtracks on the Genesis. No one song totally feels like a showstopper to me, but all of them do a great job of maintaining a pretty consistent 8 out of 10 status. Every track fits its level perfectly. While not the most original or impressive game in the genre, I do think Burning Force handles what it's doing better than a lot of the other similar shooters that came out around the same time. I'd put it well above Panorama Cotton, Jinmu Denshao, and most other Space Harrier-style shooters that I've played. Hell, I even probably like it better than the actual Genesis version of Space Harrier, which might be slightly sacrilegious to say, but I'm not gonna lie to you. Play Burning Force. Now, since we're on the topic of shmups, I think now may be the time to finally talk about a game I've been wanting to cover for a long time, Steel Empire. Sitting somewhere between the instant playability of Burning Force and the more filling sense of progression and strategy of Alisia Dragoon, Steel Empire has been one of my favorite shoot-em-ups for a very long time, and I'm gonna spend the next few minutes of your life explaining why. First, right from the jump, no other shooter looks quite like this one. Steel Empire stands in a league of its own with its disheveled, gritty, steampunk aesthetic, and it's handled pretty much perfectly here. Each stage is full of rusty browns and reds and deep purples, making each of them stand apart from each other and also making the entire game distinguish itself in the shoot-em-up genre. Little did we know back in 1992 that this motif would be done to death in the decades to follow, and while so many other steampunk games with this look have kind of disappeared into the crowd, Steel Empire still manages to stand out. Perhaps because it's not just window dressing here, but instead this permeates every aspect of the game. The agile Striker airplane and the more durable Zeppelin are perfect examples of the game's unwavering dedication to this aesthetic. I like playing both, but I gotta admit the Zeppelin is dramatically more difficult, and not always in a fun way. Sure, it can take marginally more damage before going down, but it's also much slower, and the notably larger hitbox creates even more of a disadvantage, and often makes the game's many tight spaces and fast-moving obstacles much more difficult to navigate. Just about everything you see in this game looks like it fell off of a train in 1920. Yet the game also has a hint of futurism, with some streaks of science fiction occasionally bubbling to the surface. The game quickly makes use of its various twists on the shmup formula, like the ability to shoot forward and backwards becoming more of a requirement than a choice a lot of the time, making that little extra dash of tactical depth a part of the game's personality instead of just a thing that you can do. Steel Empire also employs a very simplified version of RPG-like progression, as you regularly get to level up your firepower by collecting experience-based power-ups to build towards your next powerful milestone, instead of just grabbing instant upgrades like most shoot-em-ups from the time. Outside of all that, the gameplay is fairly standard side-scrolling shmup stuff, with screen-clearing bombs, multi-stage boss battles, ground and aerial enemies to stay on top of, and the occasional bout of slowdown, so fans of the genre should slip into this one pretty easily. Enemy variety certainly could be a little bit better though, and you will notice the same handful of design concepts getting shuffled around a bit more than you might like, and certainly a bit more than you would notice it in other higher-profile shooters of the time. Steel Empire isn't terribly difficult either, especially when compared to a lot of other shmups you'll find from this era. While it does ramp up significantly towards the end, I'd say it's a smooth incline for most of the game, making it a really good choice for beginners or just intermediate players like myself that might not necessarily be in the mood to have their heads caved in. I find that it's a good enough challenge to stay plenty engaging and even a bit more than that at times, but it never quite goes off the deep end or ever makes you feel like you need to turn the game off and go smoke a cigarette or something. The sheer spectacle of the visuals also helps keep your attention very well, so all in all, it's just a really difficult game to put down. The levels scroll in interesting directions, and things are just always changing. Despite not being quite as flashy or dazzling as something like Truxton or Musha, I'd still say in terms of general quality, Steel Empire stands among the best of them. If you can set aside 10 minutes to try it out, then the odds are good you'll want to find another 40 or so to see it through. Arcus Odyssey is the newest discovery of mine in this video, but in no way does that make it any less of a hidden gem. I've really enjoyed the handful of hours I've put into it so far, and yet can't remember the last time I've noticed anybody talking about it. Here we have sort of a dark fantasy story where an evil sorceress who once nearly destroyed the world is being revived by her followers many generations later. And now, a trusted group of warriors are all that stand in her way from finishing what she started. The whole thing is explained in a rather impressive opening scene that kind of feels more like something you'd see from a Sega CD game. Not a revolutionary story, of course, but I do enjoy the somewhat darker tone of the whole thing, and I've seen more than enough to know it's a fantastic game. For all intents and purposes, if you dig other isometric action RPGs like Landstalker or even games like Dungeon Explorer on the Grafx, then I can't recommend Arcus Odyssey enough, as it's basically a mix of those two games. We've got 4 different characters to choose from, and while they do have pretty distinct weaponry, they all have the same basic moves and controls. Both your projectile and shield are the same button, and tapping it or holding it down triggers each one respectively. There's a little variation here and there though, like the archer's arrows being able to bounce off of walls, and this character's chain and sickle having a nice AoE attack. All of them feel great and natural to play, as does opening up the menu, equipping spells, and using them when needed. It's all very intuitive and easy to get used to. Though I do struggle to remember which spell does what since they don't display their name or function anywhere in the menu, so that'll just come with experience, I guess. You get spells and other items fairly often though, so use them when you need them. Your limited space will stop you from being able to pick up more if you just hoard everything, and we don't want that. The occasional status effect and upgrades to your weapon and life meter flesh out the role-playing aspect nicely, but that's about as deep as it gets. Some more seasoned RPG fans might be left wanting a bit more, but as a more casual fan of the genre myself, it feels pretty much perfect. Just a few extra things to think about on top of the story and the action. You also occasionally run across other recurring characters that have some real personality to them, and give you clues, items, and sometimes link up with you for a bit. I like that. The action itself feels pretty tight and responsive, which is good, since enemies are aplenty and tend to respawn pretty aggressively. Each dungeon has 2 or 3 enemy types that get increasingly tricky as the game goes on, but never quite feel unfair. Some are strong and slow, some are fast and weak, and other combinations thereof, but they all have their own quirks that make them easy to beat once you learn them. The boss fights are also great fun, at least the first few of them that I've seen. They feel unique to fight, and again, have a good balance of being challenging yet fair. Getting to these boss fights can take a while though, as each level will have you exploring and backtracking through every corner, hallway, and dead end as you talk to people, find hidden passageways and keys and all that sort of stuff. And it can be a little bit obtuse at times, but honestly I'd say I encounter far less confusion and aimlessness in this game than a lot of other RPGs from the time. While the levels themselves are definitely mazes, they're not ridiculously so, and they're not so large that it takes forever to memorize them, which again is a good thing because you don't want to wander around in the wrong direction any more than you have to with enemies that respawn as often as these. Now the graphics here, I suppose, are mostly pretty average for 1991, though there are some neat effects in the backgrounds here and there, and some very bold choices for certain areas that make them stand out a lot. This one is a bit much, I think. The music here is well above average. It's not so catchy that I'm humming it outside of playing the game, but I do really enjoy it while it's happening. Also, the sound effects are pretty decent, albeit a bit on the farty side. Overall though, I think the sound effects get the job done. They add a lot of character to the combat and mix well with the visuals to create some good feedback. A little more variety would have been nice, but it's okay. So yeah, Arcus Odyssey is not my favorite RPG on the system, and I don't think it'll be yours either, but it is surprisingly good, and I suspect I'll be coming back to it every now and then going forward. The ability to play it in co-op is also definitely a reason to return, so I highly recommend this one. Now, for some reason, I almost never see anybody talk about this one, so because of that, and because I can't seem to make a video without including a Data East game, apparently, here we are with Atomic Runner, a quintessential easy-to-learn but difficult-to-master type of game. Actually, it's a little bit awkward to learn at first. It's a very deliberate mix of side-scrolling shooter gameplay and classic platforming, but not in the way you might expect. You have the auto-scrolling levels and standard shooting combat system of the former, with the platform hopping and hazard dodging of the latter. The auto-scrolling nature of the levels feels a bit weird at first, as you can't go backwards, and you often have to make split-second decisions about where you want to jump and which order to take on the nearly constant flurry of enemies. And this creates a lot of pressure that's kind of unique to this mix of genres, and the one-hit deaths also add another layer of tension. While it might be an acquired taste for some, I've personally always loved it for what it is. Atomic Runner's story doesn't have much outside of the ordinary, but the setting itself, being some sort of an unholy mix of historical elements and Cold War futurism, is very interesting, and the main character Chelnov seems to be a not-so-subtle jab at the Soviet Union's Chernobyl disaster, a joke that hasn't aged super well since Japan's Fukushima incident, but anyway. The shooting itself here is great, with several upgradable weapons that all basically boil down to a trade-off between strength and spread. None of them feel useless, and none of them feel like a blanket solution for the whole game. Upgrades, of course, increase the size and power of your current weapon, and as far as I can tell, you're basically good to go with any of them throughout the entire game, with only a couple of moments, like this little meteor shower, where you're definitely better off with a decent spread. And even though your default direction is always going to the right, you can turn around at any moment for reversed fire. You'll still be going to the right though, as Chelnov will just run backwards. Though I find that most enemies that come up from behind can be taken out with a quick flip while shooting. Pressing a direction button while jumping lets Chelnov shoot in several directions without having to turn around, which is simpler and quicker to do, saving you precious microseconds in those hectic moments. It's not always enough though, and sometimes you do need to just turn around and blast away for a bit. The music in Atomic Runner absolutely crushes. It's hard to summarize the soundtrack in terms of genre, as some tunes are upbeat and almost kind of punk rock, while others have a very sinister edge to them. It's always high energy though, with catchy melodies, great mixing that lets each part shine, and some nice stereo separation, especially in the drum fills. It's an outstanding soundtrack on its own, while also being a perfect fit for this game, and the sound effects never distract from the music or feel low quality, though they do sort of add to an impression that the game might be an earlier release than it actually is, though I can't put my finger on why. And I'd largely say the same about the graphics. They're quite easy on the eyes, with good use of color and contrast separating the background and foreground well, though this section here kinda drives me insane. Still, I like the way the game looks overall. Scrolling background layers add some good dimension when they're used, and that makes the areas where they're not feel very different and a little bit more intimate, I guess. The location variety is second to none. Every level feels distinct, as do the enemies, which are pretty cool looking, especially the bosses, though these boss battles are over a bit too fast. Even the final boss is a bit of a pushover compared to the levels that led up to him. Still a fun fight though. So despite that kind of unevenness in the challenge, I guess, I still find Atomic Runner to be an extremely engaging experience. When it's at its best, which is most of the time, it requires a very high level of concentration and knows exactly how to punish you for the smallest mistakes. Although generous checkpoints and plenty of power-ups throughout the stages will keep you playing. It gives you sticks and carrots at the same time, which I like, at least for this game. So I think that about does it for this particular topic. I definitely have a lot more things I want to say about the Genesis, and I'll definitely be talking about it more sooner rather than later. But I also have a very special video that I've been cooking up very slowly in the background for the past several months. That's coming up next, and while it will be a little bit different, I think if you're a subscriber to this channel, you'll probably enjoy it. Also, feel free to check out my TurboGrafx podcast that I do with Sarumaru. We bring on people like Shmup Junkie, DJ C, Historic Nerd, we got some other folks lined up. up. It's been a really good time. We're having a lot of fun with it. Gets pretty chaotic at times, but I think that's part of the fun. I really enjoy it, so feel free to check that out too. But until then, thanks for watching.